Welcome into the Backroads Bill podcast. I'm Ben, and on today's episode, we have a bit of a special one as we'll be talking about the grand opening of the Canadian Canoe Museum, which Bill got to go to down in Peterborough with his adventure buddy, Brian Emblin, who has been on the show a few times. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, we recorded the episode about the swimming pool down in Raven Lake. Brian and Bill were actually just coming back from the grand opening. I believe it was National Canoe Day as well. Could be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure Bill mentioned something along those lines. Anyways, they were coming back from that, so we brought Brian back on, but this time he's joining us remotely from his home in Timmins, and we talk all about their trip to the Canoe Museum, how they get their rankings, how much they liked it out of 10, though Brian decided to give it a ranking out of 5, but you know, it is what it is. And we also get a chat about some of the canoes that are in that museum, including some of the canoes that belong to some of the guests that we've had on this podcast. So it's a bit of a blast from the past. We've talked about the opening of this canoe museum a little bit on the podcast as well, and it was great to finally be able to get a chance to chat with it as well. So all of that on the way, but first, a word from today's sponsor. Founded in 1968, Voyager Aviation is a proud member of our community, providing worldwide aviation services from our headquarters right here in North Bay. If you're looking for a challenge, change, or want to expand your current career in aviation, Voyager is hiring for a wide range of technical and non-technical roles, including pilots, aircraft maintenance personnel, corporate administration, machinists, supply chain professionals, and more. Be part of a workforce that is over 400 strong, supporting humanitarian, government, defense, and civil aviation operations around the world. For a career in aviation and beyond, learn more about open positions and career paths at voyav.com. So, Bill, we have talked about this on the podcast a couple of weeks ago. We've talked about this a couple of times on the podcast on a couple of different episodes. We had Brian Emblin on. We have him on again today. You can't get rid of him. He's just always here. Welcome back, Brian.
We don't want to get rid of Brian whatsoever. But
No.
Ben, this is also a follow-up to your most recent North Bay to Mattawa canoe race exploits, because all the way down, Brian, and I was told Brian about the story about you and Michaela going into the race and getting your feet wet, so to speak, but it's
literally
dumping, and of course this trip to the Canadian Canoe Museum in Peterborough, the new recently opened Canadian Canoe Museum, and that's why Brian and I set out to go down there. And there's a whole bunch of themes that relate to canoeing in Northern Ontario, and that's what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, so the episode, I guess this would be, by the time this comes out, it would be 2 weeks ago that we did the swimming pool. The swimming pool that was in the middle of Raven Lake. You guys just came back from the opening of this museum, and that's why we had Brian in the studio there. So I guess the big thing is, let's just start off with the trip itself to the Canadian Canoe Museum. And is there any significance to why it's in Peterborough?
That's a good question. It's just that the people at the time in the original Canoe Museum, Kurt Whipper, and some of those, children's camps, those summer camps in Halibut and Muskoka, he donated the first collection of canoes, and that's how it was. The genesis of the Canadian Canoe Museum was from that collection. And then most recently, it took many years for the new concept of the Canadian Canoe Museum, and they actually put it on a place called Little Lake, which is part of the Ontonabee River that goes through Peterborough. And so they really took a long time to find the right location. And of course, it's a mammoth project. And it's the largest canoe collection in the world based on theme, because canoes, of course, dugout canoes, whatever the watercraft are akin to many, many cultures around the world.
And we know, obviously, you have a lot of awesome canoe stories, but Brian, you have a really interesting one. And I can't remember if we talked about this on a previous episode, but you had a really interesting story about your wife and when you first met her. You wanna give us the details on that one?
Yeah, so I guess we first started going out a long time ago, and we thought, well, I'll go on a little date, and we'll go for a little canoe ride. So I borrowed my dad's Scott fiberglass canoe, originally made out of in New Liskeard area, I guess. And we went down the river, the Vermilion River near Sudbury, I guess. And there was some small chutes there. We thought, well, they're not hard. We can go through that. Well, we didn't do it properly and ended up bending the canoe and putting a bit of a gash in it that needed some patching later on. But yeah, so that was a bit of an adventure on our first date. So for our wedding, I bought her a canoe for our wedding gift. That's what I bought her, as a bit of a replacement for my dad's canoe, plus a gift for my wife at the time. Yeah.
Yeah. Brian made an interesting comment to me as well. And it's also related to what all of us can recognize, that it seemed like in everyone's backyard they have a canoe somewhere, or they have canoe stories. And also, Brian, in his earlier years, grew up in Hearst, and he made another interesting comment was, at the time there was no Wonderland, so he went on a canoe trip, most likely, or camping, and canoes probably were part of that. So, but the canoe, of course, is really, really important to Northern Ontario, and of course, it was. That's one of the reasons to go to the Canadian Canoe Museum.
And of course, so the museum, the original museum, was 27 years old, roughly, according to your article, at least. And again, according to the article, has been the world's largest and most significant collection of canoes. So I guess the question is, why did they build a new museum? What is the idea behind shifting it to a new location?
Well, two things. They wanted to put it on the water so they could do hands-on things, experiential things. So it makes sense with the canoe. You don't need it in the middle of the mall. But further to Brian's comments, they have this massive collection of more than 500 canoes that people have donated and have provenance about all of them. So, for instance, I know there's a Scott Canoe there, and the whole Scott Canoe thing out of New Liskeard and Scott Canoes in Northern Ontario, which is now disbanded, but nonetheless. And just as before I forget, though, with the Oba drug bust, which we talked about episodes ago, that Wolverine canoe, and I asked Brian, they do not have a Wolverine canoe in their collection. So
they should. It's a classic.
It's a classic. And actually, I remember asking Jeremy, the curator there, about that, and he made some comments about, and I'm surprised they don't have one, but maybe I should just go and buy a beater if I get. But they were well-made canoes, and they're hard to find as well. But anyway, the 27 years. So again, with this world-class canoe collection and the generation of the modern-day museum. And you have to make it interactive, and Brian will I think describe, and maybe Brian, that's a good, maybe take us from the outside, what your first impressions were, into the inside from a general perspective, and that this is give the listeners and viewers a taste of the Canadian Canoe Museum.
But I'll give you a bit of a tip first. When you punch in your GPS and you say Canadian Canoe Museum, don't go there.
Wait, why? Is it the old one?
Yeah. We ended up in the parking lot of the old one, and you could see it was old. It's like, we ran into an abandoned warehouse, so to speak. But then we did get to the museum.
Is the old one still in Peterborough?
Oh yeah.
Okay, because that would have been that would have been a tough time if you went to the wrong place.
It's a few blocks down, and it was if I describe the old one, I would just basically describe it as an old warehouse, which then when you go to the new place, which is where Whitlaw Creek dumps into Little Lake, which is all Little Lake's part of the overall Trent Severn waterway. It's right on the water's edge. You come to this building and it's beautiful from the outside. It's not warehouse looking at all. Ample parking. You walk into this beautiful foyer. There's a little store to buy things, souvenirs and whatnot on your right. And you go upstairs and the first thing you see on your way up the stairs is I'm going to say, climate controlled storage area for their vast collection, which I forget the access requirements there, Bill, but there was we weren't able to go in at that time. Then they go to the next level, and that's where the display is. And it's really neat though. So you walk in and there's a map of the North, like Canada, Ontario, I guess, in a broader spectrum. And then there's three different kind of zones. It's broken down into, the ancient times, modern times, competitive canoeing, different themes and these different little wings, I guess, if you want to call it that. And some of them are, you can touch them. they're right there. Some of them are, behind glass or whatever, but it's pretty impressive. I personally would like to see a bit of a rotating exhibit. So some of the ones that are in the back come to the front on a short-term basis and have a little vignette story about why they're important, and then rotate them. But maybe that's coming. I don't know. But it's very, very architecturally pleasing to the eye building. There's a big reception hall if you wanted to have a wedding there or something, or a meeting. It's brand spanking new. It's very nice.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things with museums is they tend to have they will bring in exhibits from other places. So I'm curious if, and I don't know if the old one did this, but if there's going to be any potential for them to bring in maybe a curate specific styles like what you were saying, Brian, or...
Well, the opportunity is there. They have this huge database of canoes in the back, and I'm sure each one of them has a story.
Because we talked about the Wolverine canoe. That would be a great example of doing like a whole Wolverine exhibit and stuff. I know it comes all down to money and those kind of things and what it can generate, but it would be an interesting idea.
Well, I'm sure they're going to have to, because they're going to they have the operating budget, and then they have to, through gate receipts and fundraising and all their other hands-on programs, they'll have to do that, because it's the same as any other place. You don't want it to become stale, so you'll move your things around, and so there is the vast collection that they can draw upon, and just to summarize that, it's by appointment, or they'll have some timed occasions to go through, but you'll be escorted by a programmer who will give you the lowdown on certain things. Like you'll stop at Farley Mowat's canoe, or you'll stop at Gordon Lightfoot's canoe, and the Trudeau's, et cetera, et cetera. So that's those be those kinds of opportunities to do that as well at the Canadian Canoe Museum.
What were the exhibits like? Were they, or were there any interactive ones? Were they more just you kind of look around and you just kind of take in? Is a lot of reading?
Well, they're all interactive, I would say, and the lighting is such, and that it highlights the vessels and the lines of the vessels. And yes, there's always the storyboards. Some of them have video vignettes, and so it's all that kind of engage the audience, so to speak, from a multi-sensory point of view. So they've done a good job at that.
And there was some audio stuff too. You could scan a QR code kind of thing and get more information.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah. So there's all those opportunities. Now, we went around the whole museum and through things, and people ask, how long do you want to spend there? Well, as long as time as you want to spend there and get into the various individual aspects. But for me, there were three themes, and we'll talk about them individually, I think. The first one, because of my background in risk management and outdoor education, I knew that there was a blue canoe, one of the four from the Temiskaming canoe tragedy of June 13th, 1978, when 12 young boys and one young leader perished on Lake Temiskaming, the Upper Ottawa River, on the Ontario side. And of course, that set back outdoor education even to this day. But the canoe was there, so you could see because of the tragedy, they did not drown. They died of hypothermia on that day in early June. And you could see by the design of the canoe, it had not enough freeboard. It looked tippy. They had never tried it, et cetera, et cetera. So it was kind of, the story goes, it was doomed to failure. But nonetheless, when you're there, you get an appreciation of that whole event. It is a tragedy, but here's the canoe and there were boys in that canoe at one time.
Yeah, and of course that was a story that we had. Actually, a lot of these are tied to past stories that we've done. Brian, what was your favorite exhibit?
Well, getting back to that one we just talked about, I mean, they do a nice job of it too. They don't sensationalize it. It's we have to understand people died, right? It's a memorial thing. My favorite one, I enjoyed the book, the people who canoed from, they went down the Mississippi, down to the Amazon.
Oh yeah, Dana Starkelt. Yeah. They had their canoe there.
Yeah.
I enjoyed that book as a youth, and I to see that canoe in real life, it's awesome.
Yeah, and we had them on. We had Dana on, and the producer of the documentary here a while back. And actually, it's one of the longest Backroad Bill podcasts, just because it went on and on. There was so much interest. I mean, who gets to talk to someone that's canoed from near Winnipeg all the way to the mouth of the Amazon and lived to tell about it back in the day in the early 1980s, where they didn't have any passports or visas to enter all those Central American countries to go through and encounter banditos. And here's the canoe festooned with decals from all their stops along the way and the big Canadian flag. It is an epic Canadian story as far as canoeing is concerned, and also it's in the Guinness Book of Records as the longest canoe trip. But seeing that, and I purposely, and I'll get to this as well, I touched those canoes because they meant something to me from a storyboard point of view. So the canoe, as I often say, it's like your child. It has a natural connection and it's timeless, and so the canoe is part of your family.
Yeah, and so was Adam Schultz any of his canoes in there?
That's a good question. I don't know if it's in the 500, but I'm sure they will be someday.
Yeah.
One of them, of course, probably every time out he gets a sponsored canoe. And I remember in one of his documentaries at the end that there's a really poignant moment where he doesn't want to leave his canoe because it's taken him all away. And again, it's like your sidekick, your mate. Mm-hmm. It's part of you. And so, and I think every one of those canoes in there has a story, and that's that affection through the emotional intelligence that you have with this inanimate object that you get into and doing whatever you do with that canoe. And
I think what you said was really interesting when you said it's those canoes meant something to you, right? Like it's a very personal thing. Brian, for you, was there any sense of that? I know we've talked about like how you and your wife met, but was there any sort of that feeling for you, the same kind of feeling that Bill had when you saw some of these really infamous or famous canoes?
Well, it's funny you say that. So a long time ago, I had built a canoe from following a book, and my dad finished it off. Was I forget when, 90s, I guess. And that is it Moore? I don't have the book here, but anyways, seeing that one, and it was the same construction technique that I had done. It was pretty neat to see. And also, they have kayaks on display there too. And I had built a skin-on frame kayak as well a long time ago here in Timmins. And seeing one of those hanging from the rafters, from like olden days, it was pretty interesting for sure. But talking about like personal, like canoes used to be your car. You didn't have a car. Like in the ancient times, that was your mode of transportation, and your highway was the river. Like it was, if your car broke down, your canoe got a hole in it. You needed help. It's funny, we talk about people moving, but I think we also forget about, we were talking earlier about log driving. Like industries were shipping things by canoe or by water, I guess, and then by canoe as well, I suppose. But so imagine you're coming along with your canoe, moving your family somewhere, and all of a sudden you come across this log jam from a logging operation or something like that. It'd be
certainly in the early days of the fur trade. You would have there was the large Voyageur canoes and those kinds of things transporting trade goods to the west and bringing furs to the east for more than 200 years, so to speak, with the Northwest Company, Hudson Bay Company, and trading. Our first economic activity in Canada was the fur trade with Indigenous people. So all those things come to mind, and I think the point being is for anyone that goes to the Canadian Canoe Museum, there's some takeaways. And I wanted to talk briefly about, that's how I felt with when I touched Bill Mason's red canoe. I have a little red canoe that has taken me many, many places, and it's a very important. People keep toys all their lives sometimes because it's a keepsake. It invokes a lot of memories. Well, my little red canoe does that for me. And of course, Bill Mason being the great National Film Board videographer, Path of the Paddle, and many other documentaries and books. It was Fire in the Bones by James Raffam, who we've had on the show as well. who talked about the Temiskaming canoe tragedy in that episode. That meant a lot to me, just to be close to Bill Mason. He was also came to Samuel D. Champlain Provincial Park, and at one time said at a certain point on the Amab de Fond River, this would be a great spot to teach whitewater canoeing because you were up high on the bank and could see down, and the rapids were right there. But anyway, Bill Mason, so that was kind of another one of those folk heroes, those heroes that there's their canoe. So that's another thing.
Yeah, and there's a lot of really, and I'm not even a big canoe person. Like, I've learned a lot from at these podcasts, and there's a lot of names that either we've done a story about before or that you kind of recognize, right? Was there anybody, and this kind of goes out to both of you, but was there anybody that you saw a canoe there that you said, wow, I didn't know that their canoe would be in here? That's kind of surprised you? Maybe I'll start with Brian.
Well, I forgot about it's actually more of a, memory jogger. So, Olympic people, you see some competitive canoeing legends there. Their canoes are on display there, which is pretty cool to see. Very little patriotic thing going on. It's neat.
Yeah. Well, there is a wonderful CBC radio documentary called The Perfect Machine. And that's the name of the title. And it was quite a few years ago. Well, must go maybe more than 10, certainly. And it's on the CBC podcast after the news in the evening, Beyond As It Happens. But anyway, that's The Perfect Machine that just reminded Brian. For me, again, the go-to is to certainly just the three that we talked about, including Bill Mason, and just seeing the designs, the shapes. There was a freighter canoe with a motor on the back, probably from, I don't know where it was from, but they had modified it.
That was Moose and Emu's factory.
Yeah. So that was
that one.
Yeah, and the Red River carts where they transported the furs and the boats back in the day in the Manitoba, Saskatchewan way. So there's so many things. And so the canoe back, I think it was in the 2000s, but where the canoe was voted one of the 7 wonders, the leading 7 wonders of Canada. So it's a icon for sure.
And kind of makes sense when you think about the amount of the explorers who had to use it, all the portages that we have. I think Canada has the most amount of lakes in the world. I believe. I don't know that. Maybe I should check that before I say that. Canada has.
Yeah, it'll be like fact checking Donald Trump there, Ben.
Yeah,
but again, in the foyer, when you come in, Brian explained this massive map of Canada, so detailed to the point of view that all the tributaries of the rivers and creeks and lakes, and you can walk on it and bend over and point to this particular point in time. For instance, when we talked about going to the center of Ontario and the Four Corners, and you can just reach down and quickly do that. And then there's an umbrella of different vessels hanging over, and beneath it, the different words in different indigenous languages and dialects across the way, and that's kind of what you are greeted with before you branch off into the various pods that are on display.
So I was right. Canada does have the most amount of lakes.
Oh, there you go.
1.42 million lakes.
Wow.
That is a crazy number.
Well, I don't know. On this display, it's so detailed, I guess, from the satellite, but still, you get a sense of being surrounded by water, moving water or stationary water, to be sure.
I know you talked about some of the indigenous stuff. Obviously, canoes, as Brian said, like that was their mode of transportation for a lot of, especially before industry kind of took over and we got roads and vehicles and stuff. So you mentioned how they had some of the indigenous background and stuff like that. Was there like a section or a lot of areas that either highlighted certain very famous indigenous people that are connected to canoes, or like some of the settlers who came in and did a lot of the exploring and stuff?
Well, they highlighted a lot of the canoe builders and indigenous canoe builders and the like, and how that craft went. but I know one of the photos I took is that there's a really nice comparison of a birch bark canoe and underneath a cedar canvas canoe. So it showed the evolution of materials and things like that. And again, the early kayaks, because when we look at the fiberglass or carbon fiber kayaks, they look similar in shape, but that, as Brian said earlier, he made a covering on a mold, so to speak, or a frame. And so, yeah, you get the whole aspect of things that, you just take for granted as far as design is concerned.
Yeah, one of the interesting things is Canada has more lakes than the entire world combined. That's another little factoid for you. According to the internet. I don't know. Maybe the internet's never lied before. So
that's why there's so many canoes in people's backyards, I guess. Or when you see them, it's the time of the year right now when you're seeing every day people moving. And, I don't know, for me, it's you look up and you look at what's on top of their car. That's for sure. And because I'm in the Samuel de Champlain Provincial Park, I look at actually this morning I was out doing my CBC bit and it was early, and of course this halftime comes up and it had every kind of Canadian Tire center vessel in the back. There was 4 or 5 of them roped up, and I thought to myself, just a bunch of fun and people on the water.
So how much is it to get in? Because I don't, like, for people who are kind of interesting, there's obviously a fee to get into the museum?
Well, I don't know. I'm a senior, Brian's not, and so I don't know, whatever it cost. I think it was like $20, but it was each, but it was worth it all the way around. And again, we deposited some money in the tuck shop and things like that. But again, there's a food service there as well, and you can walk out down to the water where they have their experiential things and their landing for the programs on the water programs. And so, I think when I step back from the Canadian Canoe Museum and I say, wow, they finally put it on the right spot. It's like a lot of things. You can't, I don't know why the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is in Cleveland, but it's in Cleveland. So again, the Canadian Canoe Museum, I think, Brian, is in the right spot.
Oh, absolutely. It's very picturesque on the waterfront. One thing I think I have taken a bit of more interest into lately, I would love to be able to talk to the architect and go, why did you choose the, bare metal exterior? Is it to make it look like a forest with trees? Because over time it will become brown, more brown. That would be something that you could almost add to the experience to go, because I'm sure the architects put some thought into it and people just walk by and don't appreciate it.
Yeah. So questions come to mind like that, but then we already mentioned there's no Wolverine canoe there just yet. And I asked about Gray Owl. It's not in any of the stories, but the answer to me was, they were looking at design. Of course, there's no Gray Owl canoe. Was there one? I guess he borrowed them, had them, but no one had the wherewithal to keep that in his collection, I guess, unless it's out in one of the museums in Rocky Mountain National Park. But so he's not in there, and that's, I thought that was kind of interesting. They can't do everything anyway, but it might be one of those exhibits down the way.
Be cool. Just super quick, just so for people who don't know, do you want to just give a quick, let people know what the whole Gray Owl thing is? So, within a minute, not. Well,
now we talked about Gray Owl because we talked about pretending is at one of the shows, one of the podcasts.
I think that was with James. No, that was with Hap Wilson.
Hap Wilson. Yep. So Hap Wilson is one of the recipients of the Canadian Canoe Heritage River Awards, and we've had him on. So Gray Owl was the great imposter Englishman, Archie Bellany, who masqueraded as an Indigenous person. But what his whole shtick was to bring, in the 1920s, in particular in the Depression years, to bring the first look at conservation efforts. And that's what he did. He wrote a number of books. And then he was eventually found out. It's a North Bay story, actually, through the Nugget. And he was famous for that. And so, Gray Owl, I'm sure sometime will be acknowledged at the Canadian Canoe Museum.
All right, so your ratings. I need to know what you would rate the Canoe Museum experience out of 10.
Okay, well, I'm going to go to, I can do this first. I had no, I had been online and seen some of they actually, for some reason, for a while before we got there, we were there the day before National Canoe Day, but it seemed like National Canoe Day on that day. And it had opened prior to that in early May of this year, May 11th, I think it was, of 2024. So they had some virtual displays, and they've taken that down, and they're going to reintroduce this on the website. So yeah, that's out of 10. Well, I mean, if we can say, I guess further to what Brian is saying, I hope they do rotate the exhibits, and I was actually thinking it was going to be bigger than what it was. But again, there's that whole storage area that we didn't get to go into on that particular day. So yeah, no, it's a solid 8 to 9, I guess, because it's Canadiana. It's important to me. There's nothing like it anywhere else. So, it deserves a 9 for its uniqueness and our place in our Canadian heritage, and crosses many, many lines of cultural lines. And so, yeah, it's really, really important to have a place like that. I don't think it would have, it has to be in an area close to Toronto and the masses to make it pay for itself. So I think it's in the right spot. I don't think it would be the same if it was even if it was on the Toronto waterfront. I don't think it would be the same. So yeah, it's a 9.
Yeah, it feels pretty easy to get there. Like even from here, Peterborough's 4.
Well, we took the paved back roads.
Oh yeah, that's true.
And wound our way, and you kind of see neat things on the way. So it was kind of a paved back roads kind of thing. But over to Brian about his impressions.
So I would give it a 4.5 stars out of 5, and only the reason it's not full 5. I think that thing we talked about, rotating the things, and like I had a fantastic time going there. It was something that interested me at the time. It's not for little kids. It's not a playground. It has to be something that you like. But am I going to go back? No, unless there's some reason to go back. And the reason to go back may be to pull out if they had an exhibit on some.
That's a very fair point too, because I think for a lot of people, it's kind of, you see it once and you're like, cool, I've been here. I've been to museums before where you're like, I've been here. It was cool. But like, again, what you said, Brian, like, why would you go back? So I think that might be something in the future they have to think about, is like, how do you get those same people back? Because Bill, not everyone's has that same connection like you do. So it's like, how do you get somebody like Brian back, or that kind of casual person? That's going to be, I think,
well, we would want to go back to see about the Wolverine Canoe and the Oba drug bust, and people should go back and listen to that podcast. And someday, you never know, there might be a Backroads Bill Little Red Canoe there that someone will want to donate about that, but probably not. A small fish in a big pond. But yeah, that's Canadian Canoe Museum. I think if you're in the area, you should check it out, and it has a lot to do, obviously, with our podcast that we do every week.
Yeah, this has almost been like a flashback to about 4 or 5 different episodes that we've done. Kind of interesting how that works. Maybe, just maybe, if we didn't rent the canoe, we could have donated the canoe me and Michaela went
that
in.
You overturned with Michaela, and you should listen to those 2 podcasts as well, just because we've all been there.
Yeah, I'll put all the descriptions for the podcast that we talked about in the description. Brian, thank you for joining us. Anything you want to leave us off with before we go?
Oh, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it every time. I'm sure we'll have more stories to talk about.
Will.
There will be stories with Brian for sure. And the last thing, let's paddle on.
It's a pleasure, as always, to have Brian join us on the show. I think we're going to have to get him some official Backroads Bill swag at this point, because he's been on the show quite a bit, and he will be on in the future as well, because I'm sure him and Bill are going to go on many more adventures in the months and years to come. So if you do want to check out the Canadian Canoe Museum in Peterborough, they are open from 10 to 5 daily, except on Thursday, which they stay open until 8 p.m. And the admission, $20 for adults, $15 for kids between 5 and 17, and children under 4 are free. So if you find yourself in the Peterborough area, or if you're in that area already, you live there, go check it out. There's a lot of great history that is tied there, and a lot of Canada was founded and built on canoes, and from the settlers to the Indigenous, everybody has there's a big history there with the canoe and Canada's history. Well, if you want more Backroads Bill podcast, you can find us on all of your favorite podcast players like Apple and Spotify. The video version, of course, you can find on our North Bay Echo YouTube channel. And you can always head on over to NorthBayEcho.ca to not just see this podcast, but all the other podcasts we have on offer. And check out our newsletter. It's free, goes to your inbox every Tuesday and Thursday, Echo Essentials. And it's a great way to keep up to date with all of our podcasts and other news and events in the North Bay area. So that wraps things up for myself and Bill. We will see you next Wednesday for another Backroads adventure.